At around 4 in the afternoon, the sky over a quiet village near Belgorod turned into something out of a nightmare. A column of fire, then smoke climbing up until it formed a mushroom cloud you could see for miles. The ground shook. Windows blew out across an entire town. And in the gardens of ordinary people in the flower beds on the sidewalks lived landmines ended up scattered across the grass, the kind built to tear a human being apart. This was June 8th, 2026, and here is the strange part. This explosion did not happen in Ukraine. It happened inside Russia, at a Russian ammunition depot, hidden inside a Russian village, surrounded by Russian civilians. So what blew up an entire arsenal in the middle of a residential street, a stone's throw from a Russian city of 340,000 people? Who put it there? And why did the people living right next to it have no idea it even existed? Stick with me, because the answer is darker and far more humiliating for the Kremlin than a single explosion. Here is why this matters, and why it should keep Moscow up at night. For more than 4 years, Russia has sold its people one story. The war is far away. It happens over there in Ukraine to other people. Your towns are safe. Your children are safe. Sleep well, that story just exploded. Literally. Because the thing that detonated in this village was not a stray Ukrainian shell that drifted across the border. It was Russia's own war machine stockpiled in Russia's own backyard, going up in a fireball that locals compared to a small earthquake. And it fits a pattern that Ukraine has spent the last year perfecting. While the front line in the east has barely moved, Ukraine has been reaching deep hundreds of kilometers deep into Russia. Fuel depots, refineries, bridges, and arsenals exactly like this one. But to understand how a Ukrainian drone could find a hidden ammunition dump near Belgorod and turn it into a mushroom cloud, you have to understand something the Kremlin desperately does not want you thinking about. The reason this depot was sitting in a village in the first place, the reason no air raid siren saved anyone, and the reason that when it blew the locals' very first guess was not that Ukraine had struck them. It was something else entirely. Something that quietly tells you the Russian military is falling apart from the inside. Let's start at the beginning, with Belgorod itself. Open a map of the war and find the city of Belgorod. It sits in southwestern Russia, only about 40 kilometers, 25 miles from the Ukrainian border. The wider Belgorod region is big around 27,000 square kilometers home to roughly 1.5 million people. On paper, it is a peaceful region of farms and small towns. In reality, it is one of the most important launch pads of Russia's invasion. Belgorod borders 3 Ukrainian regions at once: Sumy, Kharkiv, Luhansk. And for years, it has been the staging ground from which Russia hammers the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. The troops that push toward Kharkiv, the artillery that supplies a huge amount of it, flows through Belgorod. If you are Ukrainian and you live under those bombs, Belgorod is not an innocent border town. It is the hand that throws the punch. And make no mistake about what flows the other way. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, sits just across that border. For years, its people have lived with the air raid app open on their phones because the glide bombs and the missiles that hit their apartment blocks come from positions on the Russian side. Belgorod is where a lot of that misery gets loaded up and sent. So this is not a story about a peaceful Russian region minding its own business. It is the rear base of an invasion. And Ukraine has made it so contested that at points in 2025, Ukrainian troops actually crossed the border and seized Russian villages inside Belgorod itself, shoving aside concrete anti-tank barriers as they advanced. The war did not stay on Ukraine's side of the line. It never does. Now here is the problem Russia created for itself. To keep that war machine fed, you need ammunition near the front, mountains of it, shells, rockets, and missiles stored close enough to use. The traditional answer is one big fortified arsenal far from prying eyes. But there is a catch, and it is a catch with wings: Ukrainian drones. Over the last 2 years, Ukraine has gotten frighteningly good at finding large, fixed military sites and burning them to the ground from the air. A giant arsenal out in the open is now just a giant target. So Russia got clever. Or so it thought. Instead of one huge, obvious depot, it began scattering ammunition into places drones supposedly would not look: disused factories, empty apartment blocks, and quiet villages full of civilians. This is not a guess. We have seen it again and again. In one Belgorod village, Russian forces set up an ammunition store inside an empty apartment building right next to a school. When it was hit, the school took damage. In another settlement, an entire ammo dump was tucked inside an abandoned sugar factory belonging to one of Russia's elite drone units. The logic is grim, but simple. If you hide your weapons among your own people, maybe the enemy will hesitate. Maybe the drone will not come. And if it does well, the civilians soak up the blast, not the generals. Sit with that for a second. The Russian military looked at its own towns, its own villages, its own citizens, and saw camouflage. And that brings us to Belovskoye, a small village just east of Belgorod city. So close that what happens there is basically happening in the suburbs. Somewhere in or around that village, Russian troops built up positions and stored weapons. Satellite images would later show trucks, construction material, heavy equipment, and fortified positions hidden under tarpaulins near a tree line. To the people living there, it probably looked like just another fenced-off military zone. Nothing to worry about, nothing that concerned them. And here is the question that hangs over this entire story. The question I promised you. When that depot finally went up and the mushroom cloud rose over their homes, the people of Belgorod did not point a single finger at Ukraine. Their very first instinct before any official said a word was to blame their own Air Force, their own jets, their own bombs. Why on earth would an entire population assume that their own military just dropped a bomb on them? The answer is a single number, a number the Kremlin would love for you to forget. I am going to hold it back for now because once you hear it, the whole picture snaps into focus. But keep it in the back of your mind. The locals blamed Russia first, and they had a very, very good reason. Because by the time we get there, you will realize that a Russian ammunition depot exploding near Belgorod might be the least shocking thing that could possibly happen. So how did Ukraine turn that hidden village dump into a fireball? For that, we have to look at the weapon Russia never saw coming. Through 2026, while the world kept asking why the front line was not moving, Ukraine quietly changed the entire shape of this war. Not by capturing villages, by reaching over them. Ukraine built and unleashed a long-range drone campaign that turned Russia's vast size, its single greatest defensive advantage, into a liability. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. Oil refineries that fund the Kremlin's war went up in flames. Export terminals on the Baltic and the Black Sea took hits. In just 1 week in late March, Russian oil exports reportedly collapsed by around 43%. Analysts estimated Russia's refining capacity was cut by roughly 17%. That is not a pinprick. That is a body blow to the machine paying for the invasion. And ammunition depots, they became Ukraine's favorite kind of target. Because an arsenal does not just get damaged when you hit it, it detonates. It does the enemy's destruction for them. To understand what that looks like, you have to go back to September 2024 and a town called Toropets in the Tver region. This was Russia's nightmare made real. Toropets was a massive modern arsenal, the 107th arsenal of Russia's Rocket and Artillery Directorate. It had been renovated in 2018. It covered more than 5 square kilometers with a perimeter over 12 kilometers long. And here is the line that did not age well. A senior Russian deputy defense minister had boasted that this facility met the highest international standards and could protect its weapons from missiles and even from a small nuclear strike. Then one night, Ukrainian drones flew in. The fire reached the ammunition, and the ammunition began to detonate. Not for seconds, for hours. By Russia's own admission, the site held something like 30,000 tons of munitions. To give you a sense of that, experts compared the total blast energy to roughly a 30-kiloton explosion. That is in the range of a small nuclear bomb. Built by Russia, detonated on Russian soil, it left a crater 82 meters wide. And the explosions were so violent that earthquake monitors in Norway picked up seismic waves measuring up to about 2.8. A weapons depot blew up with such force that the planet itself registered a small tremor. The fortress that was supposed to survive a nuclear strike was erased by a handful of propeller-driven drones. And the official who bragged about it, he was later arrested on corruption charges. In Russia, the words highest international standards often turn out to mean somebody got rich and the concrete is thinner than promised. And Toropets was not a one-off. In that same wave of attacks, Ukraine hit other Russian storage sites, to places like Tikhoretsk and Oktyabrsk, wiping out tens of thousands of tons of ammunition, reportedly including North Korean missiles that Russia had imported just to keep its guns firing. Ukrainian officials even had a phrase for all of it: the demilitarization of Russia. Not some slogan about peace, a very literal description of what a drone does to an arsenal. Every shell that burns in a Russian depot is a shell that never lands on a Ukrainian home. That is the cold math behind this entire campaign, and by 2026, Ukraine was running that math at industrial scale. So by 2026, the message was clear. If Russia is storing ammunition, Ukraine can find it. And if Ukraine finds it, Russia gets a mushroom cloud, which makes the Kremlin's decision to hide depots in villages look less like genius and more like pure desperation. And the cracks were not only physical, they were political too. Belgorod had a governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, who became famous for posting daily updates about every strike, every blast, every casualty on a Telegram channel, followed by hundreds of thousands of his own people. He was in a strange way the human face of a region under fire. And then, just weeks before our story in May 2026, he was gone. Pushed out, replaced by a major general, a decorated army officer who had fought in Ukraine. Moscow was no longer sending a politician to run its bleeding border region. It was sending a soldier. Think about what that signals. When you replace your governor with a general, you are admitting your region is no longer a place you govern. It is a place you defend, a front line with a postcode. And the discontent was not exactly hidden. Before he was pushed out, there were open reports that public faith in the authorities in Belgorod had soured, that the quality of life had slipped, that people were simply tired. Keep in mind, this is a region where the governor's own Telegram channel was followed by more than 460,000 people. Over 30% of everyone living there, all of them refreshing it for the next warning about the next strike. When that many of your citizens are doom-scrolling for incoming fire, you do not have a quiet border anymore. You have a whole population living on edge. And remember, that number I am still holding back. The one that explains why Belgorod blames its own Air Force. We are almost there. Because the same chaos eating Russia's arsenals was also falling out of Russia's own skies. So what finally happened in Belovskoye on June 8th? Real quick. If this is the kind of story you want to actually understand and not just scroll past, hit subscribe to Theater Brief, we dig into the things both sides would rather you missed. Okay, back to that village near Belgorod and the cloud that gave the whole game away. The night before Ukraine had thrown a haymaker. On June 7th, 2026, Ukraine's drone forces, led by a commander known by the call sign Magyar, launched a sweeping operation against 26 targets at once. Military sites, energy logistics across occupied Ukraine, and into Russia itself. That same window, Ukrainian drones set the Grushevaya oil depot near Novorossiysk on fire. This is no small tank farm. It is part of one of the biggest oil hubs in southern Russia with storage measured in over 1 million cubic meters. Locals reported hearing something like 50 explosions. And Ukrainian drones smashed into a key bridge at Chonhar, one of the lifelines connecting occupied Crimea to the mainland, forcing Russia to shut the crossing down. Ukraine reportedly used homemade drones and a brand new long-range model for that strike. So picture the situation. Russia is being hit from the Black Sea coast to Crimea to its western border, all in roughly 48 hours. And in the middle of that storm, around 4 in the afternoon on June 8th, the sky over Belovskoye lit up. First witnesses say there was black smoke rising over the trees. That detail matters. A fire first, then the big bang. That is the signature of a drone, starting a blaze that then reaches the ammunition. Then came the explosion that birthed the mushroom cloud, and then the part that turns a military strike into a horror story. The secondary detonations. When an ammo dump goes up, it does not explode once. The first blast cooks off everything around it. Shell after shell, rocket after rocket going off in a chain that can last for hours. Russian authorities had to close roads leading into the area streets with names like Makarenko and Konstantin Zaslonov because the depot was still exploding. And then the weapons started landing in people's lives. Residents walked out into their yards and found unexploded ordnance scattered across their gardens, their sidewalks, their public spaces. Worse, they found landmines, anti-personnel mines, including a type called the POM2. We will come back to exactly what that is because it is one of the cruelest twists in this whole story. The damage spread fast. What started as reports of a few apartment blocks and a couple dozen homes climbed by some local accounts to around 230 houses and apartments damaged along with social buildings, shops, an administrative building, and a warehouse. 5 women were reported concussed by the blast. And officials ordered the entire village of Belovskoye evacuated, sending residents to a shelter in a neighboring village because their homes were now sitting in a minefield that used to be a secret. And hours after the first blast, the explosions were still going. Authorities admitted the secondary detonations had not stopped, which is exactly why they pushed the whole village out to a shelter in a neighboring town and told people to stay away until further notice. Then there is a detail the analysts flagged that should genuinely chill you. Those satellite images did not just show a depot, they showed fortified positions dug in and covered over the kind of positions you build for troops, not for paperwork. Observers noted that the scale of it pointed to something bigger than a storage shed. Russian soldiers were very likely there when it cooked off. Russia predictably said nothing about that either. What was actually stored there? Russia, of course, said almost nothing. Officially, they described it as a detonation in an administrative building. An administrative building, as if a filing cabinet had simply combusted and started flinging landmines. Independent local monitors told a very different story. They pointed to those satellite images of fortified positions and military gear and reported, though it is not officially confirmed, that the site may have held missiles for advanced air defense systems or even Iskander complexes. Serious, expensive, hard-to-replace weapons. And Ukraine said nothing at all. Because that is what a confident military does. It does not brag. It just reaches into your territory, turns your hidden arsenal into a crater, and lets the mushroom cloud speak for itself. Which finally brings us to that number. The one I have made you wait for. Because it explains the single strangest reaction to this whole disaster. Why the people of Belgorod looked at that fireball and blamed Russia. Here it is, 133. That is roughly how many bombs Russia's own Air Force dropped by accident onto Russian soil and Russian-occupied territory in 2025 alone. 133 own goals. And it did not stop. By the spring of 2026, Russian jets had already dumped at least 24 more bombs onto their own side. These are not small fireworks. These are the heavy aerial bombs Russia drops on Ukrainian cities, the FAB series. They have malfunctioned or been released by mistake so often that they have fallen on a Russian railway and derailed a train. They have fallen on Russian neighborhoods, leaving craters 20 meters deep and forcing well over 1,000 people, including hundreds of children, to flee their homes. There was even a moment back in 2023 when one of these jets accidentally blew a crater into the middle of a Belgorod street. It has become a grim routine, and these are not rumors. In January 2026, a Russian jet dropped one of these bombs right next to apartment buildings in Belgorod. It did not even explode, and it still tore a crater roughly 20 meters across, dangerous enough that the authorities evacuated around 1,600 people, including more than 270 children. A few months later, another Russian bomb came down on a railway line and derailed a passenger train. And here is the kicker about warnings. When one of these own bombs fell near a Belgorod power substation, no air raid siren went off beforehand. None. Because the threat was not coming from Ukraine. It was falling out of Russia's own sky, and you do not get an alert for that. So now you understand. When a giant explosion went off near Belgorod, the locals did not think Ukraine. They thought, oh no, not again. Our own planes, because for them being bombed by their own military was the more likely explanation. Let that sink in. The Russian armed forces have become so unreliable that their own citizens assume friendly fire before they assume the enemy. And that is the real reason Ukraine's strike landed so cleanly. Russia's own chaos is the perfect camouflage. When your skies are already raining your own bombs, an enemy drone slipping in to finish the job barely stands out. Russia did not just fail to protect that depot, it built a country where things blowing up is not even surprising anymore. Then there is the final bitter punchline. The POM2 mines in those gardens. Those are banned, indiscriminate weapons built for one purpose: to maim and kill foot soldiers. Russia stockpiled them to use against Ukrainians. Instead, they got blasted into the flower beds of Russian grandmothers. The weapon meant to cripple the enemy is now lurking in the lawns of the very people it was supposed to protect. That is the whole war in one image. Step back and look at what Belovskoye really tells us. For 4 years, the Kremlin's biggest promise to its people was distance. The war is over there. We are safe over here. That promise is dead. The war is now in the gardens of Belgorod. It is in the smoke over the oil terminals at Novorossiysk. It is in a bridge to Crimea that keeps getting cut. Ukraine has taken Russia's greatest strength, its enormous size, and turned it into a giant attack surface where nothing is truly behind the lines anymore. And notice the trend. While Russia struggles to push its front forward by a few empty fields, Ukraine is methodically dismantling the machine behind that front. The fuel that powers it, the bridges that supply it, the arsenals that arm it. You can win ground and still be losing the war if the thing feeding your army is on fire 300 kilometers in your rear. Even the Kremlin's own body language gives it away. Moscow scaled down its sacred Victory Day parade out of fear of drones. Drones reached the suburbs of Moscow itself, and in Belgorod, they swapped a governor for a general quietly admitting the obvious. That region is not a peaceful borderland. It is a battlefield. Now think back to where we started. That mushroom cloud over a quiet village. Ordinary people walking into their own yards, stepping carefully around landmines that their own army left behind in a depot their own government hid among them, and then pretended was just an office building. That is what the failure of the Russian war machine actually looks like up close in someone's backyard. Not a line on a map, a live mine in the grass where a child plays. And the most damning part of all, when it finally happened, the people who lived there were not even surprised. So here is my question for you. If a country's own citizens assume their own air force is bombing them, how long can that military really keep fighting? Drop your honest take in the comments. I read them. And if you want the stories behind the headlines, the ones that show you how this war is really going, subscribe to Theater Brief and turn on notifications. We will see you in the next one.